Good afternoon to you. This is Angela with Park Rose Permaculture. It's a beautiful, cool, overcast afternoon in Portland, Oregon, in my Zone 8B permaculture food forest. I'm sitting under my pergola in my backyard, and I am about to root some cuttings. So I wanted to share with you a little bit about the plant that I'm getting ready to root. So this is a plant that I used to grow several years ago, and then we had a very cold winter and they died. So I neglected to have cuttings going or protection for them, and I lost it. And I don't know why over the last few years, probably because I've been really busy with roller derby, I haven't bothered to restart this plant, and I'm really missing having it in my garden. So I posted in my local gardening group, East Portland Gardeners, and I asked if anybody had this plant growing and could I come take cuttings, and several people generously said yes. So I went over and drove to Southeast Portland, and a very lovely woman let me come in her garden and pick these. So let me show you here. What I'm rooting today are tree collards. And tree collards are a perennial brassica, Brassica oleracea, a variety. I'm going to forget the variety. I'll think of it before the end of the video. But they are unlike other brassicas like cabbage and cauliflower. You can see the leaves look a little bit like a cauliflower leaf, or kales or collards, or they are perennial. They are a plant that has been grown for a long time, probably 300 years. The origins of it are not really clear, but tree collards are lower in oxalic acid than other members of the brassica family, and that makes them have a really nice sweet flavor, and also they're less hard on your kidneys. If you have kidney issues, eating a lot of raw brassicas can be difficult because that oxalic acid is rough. So you can eat these. I don't particularly like them when they're raw, unless they're the little baby leaves. So if you pick the little ones like this, I think they're fine raw. The bigger ones I would cook like kale or collard, and the leaves can get much bigger than this, particularly if you live in a warm climate. They do very well in a warm climate. So let's talk about how I want to root them, and then I'll talk a little bit more about what they need to grow. So first thing you want to do if you're going to root them is you want to snap off all of the leaves here. And you can use your pruning shears too if you want to use those, and just cut these off. And then I'm going to be rooting a bunch of them because they don't always all take. So what I found is that in the past, and with rooting a lot of things, it's good to have a little bit of an insurance policy because you're not going to get all of them to take. Okay, so now I'm left with a stalk. So in general, when you root things, I know I spoke earlier in one of my videos about rooting currant cuttings, you want to remove the extra greenery because it's just going to suck water from the plant, and the plant has no root system yet, so it can't really draw up water well. So you're just asking for your cutting to not make it if you leave those leaves attached. And sometimes you can leave one or two, and sometimes you don't need to leave any. You can actually root this plant without any leaves attached. So I like to leave a couple of nodes, and those will all, I don't know if you can see here, here's a node, and there's already a new little leaf sprouting from right above where I pulled the other leaf off. So I'm gonna cut above that at an angle, and you always want to cut at an angle so that you are allowing it to shed water. And then the bottom I'm going to cut at an angle as well, because that's desiccated from having sat in the back of my car. And then this is all you need to do. You need some good potting mix, and then you stick it in, and you want to firmly press it down. And then I'm going to want to water that well, keep it damp like I would for germinating seeds, or I find some people put a plastic bag over it, and you don't really need to do that. So you can just stick that puppy in the ground there. And then this one, we'll see if this one goes. And I just want to push those down, and that's it. give it a good water, and it will take several weeks. So it depends how warm it is and what conditions it has. Don't put this in full sun. And if you water it carefully, in about maybe 6 weeks, maybe 2 or 3 months, you'll have roots developing and you can plant it out. Now, if you have a place in the ground where you can consistently check on it and make sure it's watered and it's shady, you can actually root these straight in your garden. So I do this also with my sea kale, which is Crambe maritima, which I have a video on that, which is related to this, but not as closely. You can just take cuttings and stick them straight in the ground in your garden. And as long as you remove those extra leaves and you have consistent water, it will root. And so this is the same way. Again, maybe 80% of the time. So I could cut this here, cut a fresh bottom on it, stick this in the ground, and provided it's not scorching hot and the ground isn't allowed to dry out, so stick it in a shady spot where I can check on it. In permaculture, we talk about our zones of gardening and zones of living, and things that need to be tended to often you want to put near your house and in the way, like in a path or near a path in an area that's highly trafficked. So for me, that's right out my back door. That's a great place. I root things in the ground. So I'm going to stick a number of these in the ground and see how they do. And I'm going to check on them. And in a few months, I should have roots, and I'll have tree collards that I can plant out in my garden. So let's talk a little bit about the growing conditions that tree collards need. So let's look again at a leaf here. So they have these big leaves and they're leathery, but unlike some of the other kales that when they get big, the leaves, the stem along here can get kind of fibrous and stringy. Tree collards are not nearly, they're not stringy like that. So I find you can cook the whole thing. So these leathery leaves do well at resisting water loss, although if you have a very long hot span in the summer, you may want to consider giving them some additional water. Other things that they need to grow are they really like full sun. So let me tell you what happens if they end up in less than full sun, is they can get powdery mildew on them. If you've grown annual kales and other brassicas, you can find that they get powdery mildew on them late in the season, and these are no different. So just being aware of avoiding overhead watering and avoiding too much shade will help make sure that you don't develop that on your tree collards. They also can get aphids, just like any of the other like kale, and they also can get cabbage lopers. They can get little caterpillars on them, the same way that any of the other brassicas can. I found they're far less prone, just like kale is less prone to cabbage lopers than the broccolis and actual cabbage. This is less prone to it. If you harvest them, you can just rinse them in a saltwater solution and kill any of the bugs that are on them. When I grew these in the past, my experience was both of those pests, aphids and cabbage loper caterpillars, were not enough of a predation pressure to impact the harvest. So, other things they need: sun, don't overhead water. They really like extra nitrogen and calcium. So if you're thinking about these plants, when you're growing an annual kale, this is different. You want to treat it like a perennial where you are feeding the soil and you're making sure it has good soil conditions. So if you have a really nice rich humus, that's awesome. If you are still in the process of regenerating your soil biology and your plants might need a little extra assistance, you can use liquid gold, you can use diluted urine, and you can use 9 parts water to 1 part urine as a good source of nitrogen. You can grow these with a ground cover of clover or vetch or peas to fix nitrogen. And you can use crushed oyster shells or crushed egg shells as an extra source of calcium. Those are all good things to think about amending your soil with when you are growing a perennial plant that can live 20 years. So you can also think about the last important need of this plant, which is that tree collards, unlike a regular kale, sometimes people grow kales like dinosaur kale that can end up being 3, 4, 5 feet tall. And you're harvesting off the main stem, right, like this, and you're picking and the plant gets taller and taller. This has the same growth habit in that if you harvest the bottom leaves, what you find is that it just gets taller and taller and develops a thick woody stem. And what you get is production at the top, but it tends to flop over. And you often get these kind of S curve or U curve to the branches. So this plant does benefit from staking if you want it to be really upright. I find that it helps here if it's windy in the winter really to stake it because they can be brittle a little bit. I mean, they have a tough stem, but if it's quite windy and they are loaded with a lot of foliage at the top, they can snap. Okay, other things that you need for growing this plant. They are hardy to 20 degrees Fahrenheit, that's -7 Celsius. If you look at this variety that I got, it has a really purpley hue to it. Some of the tree collared varieties that are straight green are supposedly less cold hardy. And I haven't seen any data to back that up. That's just sort of word of mouth kind of from folks who grow tree collards. I've read that several places and had friends who've grown them for a long time make that comment that they feel that the purple ones are more winter hardy. So if it's going to get below 20 degrees Fahrenheit for a consistent amount of time, you might think about wrapping these in burlap or even just a bed sheet overnight. We are in zone 8B here, and so sometimes it'll get colder than that. And I have some plants in my garden that that's the border for them. And so I tend to just throw a sheet on them, and that can give enough of a protection. Okay, so this is a plant that if you want to grow it and you can't find somebody to swap or borrow from, there is an organization called projecttreecollard.org, and I just heard about them. I didn't know there was such a thing, but they are a group out of California that is dedicated to helping folks grow tree collards, and they sell cuttings and rooted plants. I believe they have a variety I've never heard of. They have 2 green varieties and a purple variety, and I think I may end up buying, when they're back in stock, their green varieties that I'm not familiar with and just see how they do up here. You also, so tree collards, you can grow them from cuttings, right? But you also sometimes can grow them from seed. And some varieties of tree collard really don't set seed very often. And some varieties will set seed once a year, twice a year, maybe once every 5 years. Unlike with some perennials, when they flower and set seed, they don't then die. They keep on living. So don't stress out if you have a tree collard and it starts to set seed. The seed looks very much like any other kind of radish, kale seed that you may have. And the seed pods can be dried, and you can try and grow this from seed. Unfortunately, what can happen is that they may not come true from seed, but also that's the beauty of genetic diversity. When you're taking cuttings, you're making a clone. These seed pods, you can try and germinate them and see what you get. You may get an even better tree collard. So I'm going to dry these and see what I get from them. I'm going to germinate them over the winter. So I hope you enjoyed this little video on rooting tree collards. I will definitely have an update and let you know how they are doing here in a couple of months and show you when I plant them out in the garden. Again, if you can't access them through your local gift economy, then consider projecttreecollard.org. Hope you enjoyed this, and I will be back soon with more from the garden.